Hey, what's good, family? It's been a long time since I've made an actual drum video. I believe that the first video I ever made on this YouTube channel was about drums, and I'm just going to go ahead and play this and then we'll talk about it. Here's what we're going to make today. Starting from freaking crazy, right? So I had quite an epiphany of a lot of things that I've been studying from a lot of YouTube videos and just kind of reciprocating knowledge. And I think that there's a few points that I'd like to kind of bring back up to the table. And first of all is like, if you're an expert at something, then 9 times out of 10, whenever you find new things, it's usually from going back to something that you already know. As a lot of you guys know, I am a martial arts instructor, and part of the big thing whenever I got my black belt was instead of learning all the cool stuff that you think that you're going to once you achieve an instructor rank, it's more so of you find it all when you go back to everything from the very beginning, or aka being a white belt or whatever, whatever rank you may or may not have. And in this case, after watching a lot of videos specifically regarding stuff with Audica, and then also just looking back at some of the privates that I've done with some people and all that, drum design has kind of come down to 3 main things for me. And the first one is compression, the second one is EQ, and the third one is distortion. Now, to kind of accentuate what I mean, I have come up with a stupid little chart for you guys, and it looks like this, which I will have on my Discord that you guys can go and download and all that. And this just kind of talks about the relationship between how you can use this to design drums, but also how they kind of affect each other. I'll start on the left side, I guess, just because it usually moves from left to right. The optional factors are the reverb and the transient shaper. Within the reverb, if you're trying to get creative with your drum design, it's a very cool way to use heavy reverb before compression and distortion to add like really cool artifacts. But you have to be careful because it will obviously add stereo to your sounds. So having just a touch of it and then using the transient shaper with a long release will sometimes create like really cool, tails. And then as well as using the transient shaper on its own, you can use that to increase the attack and release. However, it's not an ADSR, so the effect that you're going to get as opposed to just using regular compression will be a little bit different. The first thing that you want to usually look at, and these can be done in any order, but just as long as you understand their functions, then it doesn't really matter, I guess. With equalization, it shapes tones, but sometimes it removes your wanted frequencies. And what I mean by that is because of the way that an EQ works, it's always going to have a little bit of bleed. It's always going to have a little bit of resonance that's just not quite where you may or may not want it to be. So we can use this as to our advantage of pulling something out, let's say the fundamental of a snare, but whenever we cut or whenever we boost the snare, it's not always going to be like just that particular frequency. So sometimes you're going to have to play a little bit of a balance game in order to achieve the tone that you want. The next thing that we go into is compression, which to me is the biggest thing that's going to create really hard-hitting transients. The potential issue with that is that if you have drums that have a lot of dynamics in them, for example, the transient is so much like polar different than the rest of the the rest of the drums, or there's some, harmonics in there that you want to stay quiet, or that you kind of want to have where you have some kind of reverb. Generally a compression or using a compressor will flatten everything out, which may or may not be desirable, so it's just important to keep that in mind. Finally, we have distortion, which to me just honestly, it adds harmonics, of course, but you have to be careful with it because too much distortion will dull the transient. What I mean by that is since everything becomes so flat, it also potentially removes the dynamics, especially during the transient. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at like what makes a good drum, or what makes it this kind of like punchy style of drum in the first place. This is a bounced out version of what we just listened to. And you can see right here at the beginning that there's a lot of, there's dense lines that are very close together, and that represents the transient in its own right. And as the, waveform or the sound bounces along, you can see that they get further and further and also smaller from each other. The same thing with the snare. There's a lot of dense fuzz or dense noise that happens here and then it fades out. And if you kind of understand this about transients, then it doesn't really matter what you use as a source sound. I can take a pot, or I can take, even a glitch or something and create a transient out of it, thus creating a drum. Does that make sense? So keeping all that in mind, the stuff that we have here is honestly just a combination of all of those. And the only thing that you want to keep in mind, to make this particular sound is the particular order of the effects that I've used on this. But if you understand how EQ, compression, and distortion work, then it's very difficult to go wrong as long as you understand what's happening to each of the sounds as you develop that, and we'll cover that here in a second. So before I go on, something I've been thinking about doing is a potential vlog. There's a lot of stuff happening in my life that I may or may not want to document, or that you guys may or may not be interested in. Like, for example, right now it's hot as heck. You might hear the crickets outside because my window's opening and the fan is on high and my AC is out, so I literally have an ice pack under my laptop right now to keep it from exploding. But yeah, aside from that, like, I was supposed to take a contract for a cruise for Cirque du Soleil, and that didn't work out. But at the same time, my instructor came from Canada, and he brought one of his instructors who is a 7th degree in Taijutsu, and I learned some really cool stuff. Not that I can share that with you guys because it's kind of like secret information, but it was like mind-blowing. Have you ever seen an old man that can literally like kick your butt? I learned a thing or two about experience. So those are some really neat things that may or may not be exciting to you guys, even though I know it's a different world than music production. So yeah, crazy things in my life aside, let's go ahead and dive into how this stuff is made. So first off, what I'm using is Superior Drummer 3. And if we just kind of have a general overlook of this, I want to talk about a couple of things that will kind of give you the right mind frame of how to set this up for everything else in the future. And what I mean by that is generally within these drums, they're all relatively dry. So if I hit this kick, let me solo this. So if I hit this kick and the snare, you'll notice that it's relatively dry. And the reason why we do that at the beginning is because it means that we can do more with it. If it has a ton of reverb in it, you can mix it and all that creatively, but if you're just trying to create a really sharp sound, or I guess a really tight sound, then doing this will become more malleable. Over in the mixer section, the only thing that I really want you to pay attention to is right here on the envelope releases. And again, that's just kind of shortening the release times of all of these. And I've done that with the snare, the kicks, the snare mics, the kick mics, and then the overheads and ambiances. Maybe the ambience near, ambience mid. Okay, so just the overhead dynamics. And you can see that there's literally nothing else on here. As far as a creative means, just because we're in Superior Drummer, if I turn on some reverb at the beginning after the chain and I play this, let me make sure that I am on the correct octave. I also need to arm the track. Then let me turn all this other stuff on. Yo, you get some really cool stuff. So I'm super excited about this video. Yeah, you get some really neat stuff at the beginning of the reverb that kind of creates that like vacuum suction sound, and as you can tell, it's pretty awesome. So yeah, as far as your setup goes, the only thing that you want to do is make this really dry. So if you have like a regular dusty kick and a regular dusty snare or something, then you're already kind of good to go. And you can always add in your own reverb to create a similar effect. So I'm going to cover this and this as well last, so that the first three effects, because this is stuff that I've added at the end, and I don't want you to try to use that right when you first start designing this stuff. All right, so looking at the chain, the first thing that we have is some EQ, and what this is boosting the fundamental of the kick and the snare, taking off the super lows. I actually think that I want to roll this off until like maybe 25 or so, and then just trying to level this out a bit. So if we listen to this, you can see that the peaks match up with the placement of the kick and snare respectively. This little boost right here is just trying to mellow out and even out these on here, and then boosting the high end just a little bit. And you can see that like this is the most dramatic peak that I have, and that's because everything else kind of wants to be a little bit more subtle, as the compression and distortion are going to accentuate that. Okay, let me talk about this plugin really quick. So Pro MB continues to surprise me every time I use it and every time I revisit it. So the first time that I did this, which was about almost a year ago, I think. Oh my gosh, time flies. Yeah, it's been a while. So the first time that I showed you guys this, I had you just kind of pull everything up. And that's not necessarily, you can do that way and you can get some really cool results, but if you actually take the time to learn this stuff, then it's a freaking monster. And the whole reason why I bought Pro MB in the first place was because I wanted to find something that mimicked Maximus from FL Studio. And if you don't know Maximus, it is one of the best tools that you can use as far as multiband goes for creating like just drums that punch you in the face. And I'm still trying to figure out the algorithms of how it works, but basically with this stuff we have multiple bands that control different obviously forms of compression. And so what I've done is I've turned up the range, which is the gain of like how it detects, and then adjusted the thresholds, turned the attack up and the release up. And it's backwards on this because more attack on this means that it's going to hit harder as opposed to take longer like an envelope. So you want to make sure that that turns up. And then honestly, I've just adjusted the bands to make this, well, punchier. So let me turn all of these off and then we can listen to how that sounds. So even though it's only in this particular stage, listen to this. Actually, let me turn the reverb off too. And then after. While it's not the most overly dramatic in this particular stage, everything else that builds on it is going to have a more solid foundation. And using the MB at this particular point during the beginning stages is going to be very beneficial to you. Next up, we have some Saturn that's not really, it is doing some drive, but the more important thing is the dynamics right here. And this is kind of a transient shaper in its own right. Some people refer to it as compression, but basically you can adjust the attack or the release of this. Or sorry, you can adjust the release of this of how you draw things out. And if I accentuate that, let me turn this off too. If I turn this down, you see how the drums get much shorter. And then if I turn this up, then it will kind of pull that out a little bit more. So this is honestly like the biggest function that I use for FabFilter Saturn. If you have a transient shaper, then you can use that on this as well, which I will actually talk about in the next section here. But yeah, I mean, if you have the plugin, then great. You don't actually need it to do this. This is just what I used. And I hope that this doesn't discourage you in the future as well, because I know that my channel uses a lot of plugins, but part of the reason why I do it is because I like to see how different distortions or I guess effect plugins affect the sound as opposed to just using the same one. But more importantly, it's understanding that it doesn't really matter that I'm using Saturn. You can use a saturator. You can use an overdrive to achieve the same results. The functions of the knobs of understanding that this is drive, which equates to distortion. This is the dynamics, which equates to the transient shaping. You might have to do a little bit of legwork, but that's not to say that you need to go out and buy all these plugins, if that makes sense. So moving on, let's go to the drum bus. This is cool. When drum bus first came out, I did not give it enough credit because I didn't really understand how the plugin worked. But this is pretty much a compressor slash transient shaper in its own right. The transient release is right here, and then the drive is kind of like the attack. So the crunch is kind of the, I guess, high end or harmonics that it will add, and then you can also add sub, like a boom or I guess a bass fundamental to further support your drums. Now the reason why this is important is because it can potentially add a hard fundamental to the bass of your kick. To the fundamental frequencies of your kick and snare. And not only does it make it more cohesive, but it can potentially allow you to avoid having to layer. So here's what that means. The kick has a really good transient on it, but it's missing a lot of body within it. But if I add this, oh my gosh. Look how much harder that slaps. And this is only on a soft setting with 0 drive. So make sure that you turn the compression on this, and then the settings on here are kind of arbitrary other than everything is kind of tuned to F. So that's, yeah, this is important. So I've used some EQ, then I pulled everything out with some multiband compression, then I gave it some more distortion. This is kind of serving as both compression and distortion, and now I want to make sure to try to balance the sound out again, so I'm going to use EQ to shape the tones of this. And this honestly isn't doing a whole lot other than cleaning up the bottom end and then also taking out the snare fundamental just a little bit because it's a little bit too prominent. So it's a little bit sharp, and that kind of helps deaden that out just a little bit. Finally, we have the creative stuff, which is the Ohmside. And I use Ohmside generally to give like creative distortion effects because the algorithms in here are kind of like, they're usually way different than even on trash or kind of anything else. It's a unique thing. Just take a listen to how it sounds. Actually, let's do a before and after again. Let's listen before and then after. On the snare, there's a little bit of crunchiness to this. Let me solo. You'll hear what I mean. You hear that? That's kind of what that's doing on the cubic. and then this is kind of giving it some really nice low end. These other two that I'm using are more so for other creative means, so like that's a little bit too much, and then that's also a little bit too much, so I've taken that out. If I add in another instance of trash, I think that the only thing that's happening is it's on band 2. Is this even doing anything? Yes. Okay, so it's adding just a little bit of high-end noise, which I think is on stage 2. I don't even think that I did anything in stage 1, so I could have just done that, but the smooth overdrive is giving it some noise on the top. It's giving it some of that crispiness. You can use some erosion to counteract that or to make that, yeah. So the next up, I'm using a different compressor, which is the Wolf. This is really cool for lo-fi. The compression is really big, and I don't think that that's supposed to be on, so let's listen to that. Okay, so that's just kind of like punching you in the face at this point. The compressor is basically making the transient really harsh. And then if you all honestly like want to make this sort of lo-fi, or if you want to do more to it, you can put on the noise gain, which makes it do this. Wait, it's really low. I don't even know if you can hear that or not, but it just gives it some noise, and then you can. Hopefully you can hear the difference between that. You can also make them sound like wonky. You can see that, especially on the snare, the pitch drifts on the wow setting. So to kind of wrap things up, we have some OTT on this, and that is just kind of balancing everything out again. And then the utility is turning this down ever so slightly, keeping the bass frequencies in mono, and then is being pumped out just a little bit. Oh, never mind. This is probably mellowing the sound out, actually. Yeah, because it's already peaking. So this is keeping it from going in the red, and the punchy setting with the attack all the way up and the release all the way at the bottom. To kind of recap, compression, EQ, distortion, doesn't really matter what those settings are. If you kind of start to cycle through, like even if you just slap on a bunch of EQs and then a bunch of distortions and then a bunch of compressors, and then you just try to mix and match, like you will probably get relatively close to this. The reason why it has a metallic sound is just because of the snare on its own, but I can switch this to a different snare and then we can. So really the cool thing about having this rack is I can just switch to any of these snares, which there's a huge list of, and just kind of cycle through. That one's kind of cool.
Oh, that's nice.
In the first video that I did of this, I used multiple instances of different sound sources, but it's not so much the sound source that really matters too much. It's more so about the effects. And if you can kind of grasp how all of that works, then you will be successful in making drums that punch you in the face. Before we go, the final plugins that I want to talk about are the CLA drums, which is a transient shaper ultimately. It's just kind of pulling everything down to where it's not giving me so much tail. So if I turn this off, it tightens everything up a little bit, and then adding some reverb before everything just kind of gives it some space. That's not meant to happen, sorry. It's like, the reverb is too much, I can't handle it. Alright, well I'm just going to leave that off, and yeah, we can talk about that later. So if you want to do some optional stuff, you can add in another transient shaper, which is doing this, making it super tight so it's on that hard setting, and then I think this is some reverb that's going to give it some character. Oh, nice. Well, you can hear at least the transient of it, how it kind of has that, dare I say, the industrial tone, but obviously with OBS happening at the same time, my computer can't quite handle it. But some optional stuff basically is to add a really tight transient shaper and then add in some really heavy reverb. On this has, it's not that big, never mind. You can add in a touch of reverb and you'll get different timbres or different tails to kind of make everything just sound different as opposed to dry drums. And then you can really just like mess with this. If you add the reverb at the beginning, then you get some really neat stuff, but that's just kind of part of it, is knowing, it's not just knowing what tools to use, it's knowing when to use them. And if you pay attention to the sound and you kind of get used to the formula, then you'll start to figure it out, but that's going to become the trial and error process. And that is probably the worst news that I'm going to give you, because it's not like after watching this you're going to make stuff exactly like this. I would not be surprised if someone's like, man, I followed your video exactly the same and it's not the same. That's because it's not going to be. And that's okay, because I'm not here to teach you how to make these drums. I'm here to teach you how to make drums like it. Does that make sense? And if you can kind of take that away from that mindset, then you will feel much better about your own sound design with your drums. So that's cool. Oh, okay, that's tuned super high, so that's why it sounds like that. But yeah, that is a new video on how to make drums that hit really freaking hard. You can also just use like Kick 2 or something for 808s, and yeah, for both kicks and snares, or just use operator. But if you have a grasp on this kind of stuff, then you can kind of get in those like crazy tones and all that are pretty nice sounding. No, they are not quite up to Disprove's level yet, as you may or may not have watched in the last video, but I think that it's safe to say that as I continue to grow as a sound designer and music producer, I am getting closer and closer to achieving the sounds that I want to get. And I'm happy to share my journey along with you guys, so that way you don't have to go and make not only the same mistakes that I did, but kind of just give you a head start on knowing what to look for. And that's what my channel is designed for anyways. So I'd like to thank you guys all for watching my content. Please excuse if I'm like panting. Again, I'm so freaking hot right now. My back is totally sweating, and my dogs are really upset that yeah, it sucks. So as a final thought, I'm not going to be uploading the project this week. It's going to take me a little bit of time to get this up because I have more stuff to cover within the same project file. However, I will be happy to take a screenshot of this and post it on Discord, and also give you guys the samples if you are a Patreon subscriber, which, by the way, thank you guys so much. I finally hit like 10 patrons, and that might not seem like a lot, but it really means a lot that I have just a small amount of support for putting the work into this. So the good news of all of this is that I'm finally getting Final Cut here in a couple of weeks. The bad news is that my computer has a recall on the battery, so I have to send this into Apple, and the only way to do that is by mail. So that's why this video is going to be a little bit early. I'm pretty pissed about that, to be honest, but I don't really know what my other options are. So please bear with me, although I will stay active on the Discord channel, and I will try to answer any questions that you may or may not have on YouTube. Feel free to get active on there. We have a great community that is growing, but that's kind of the that's kind of the best that I can do. Since my computer is going to be gone, I actually will be spending some more time with the Akai Live, or sorry, the MPC Live, and I'm excited to just kind of make some lo-fi and get away from having to produce like the really hard to make stuff and just make hip-hop. But if I come up with any kind of music or whatever, I'm going to be happy to share that with you all, just because that's what we all do. And yeah, so thank you guys for your subscription, for watching this video. Thank you for the patrons. Thank you for just allowing me to take a little bit of time out of your life and hopefully give you some insight regarding music production. And that's all I got for you guys today. Happy producing. I will see you in a couple of weeks.